Hi everyone, and welcome to another session of CPD Conversations with the Ink Scholar. I'm Hayley Hughes, and I'm really pleased to have Miss Jones with me this evening. Hello.
Hello, it's lovely to see you.
And you too, as well, after this really crazily insane week back that we've had after the final, hopefully, lockdown that we've just experienced. How has your week been?
Oh, it's been intense, but I am glad to be back at school and to see all of my students again. And most of them, I think, are happy to be back too. So that's great.
Well, I thought most of mine would be quite happy to be back. And then when I asked them, they kind of were like, boo. I think they were quite enjoying being in pajamas and, waking up that little bit late. So, but
Yeah,
I'm really pleased to have mine back as well. It's great, isn't it? It was like teaching with all of the good bits taken out and just doing all the
yeah,
rubbish bits that nobody really enjoys. So, good times, hopefully plowing ahead. So,
yes.
anyway, back to this evening. We're going to be looking at a poem that I actually wasn't that familiar with, to be honest, because it's on the Edexcel conflict cluster, isn't it?
Yes.
And I haven't ever taught Edexcel properly. I've always been an AQA gal with a brief affair with Welsh Board at one point. So we're going to be looking at Professor Benjamin Zephaniah's No Problem this evening. And this was your choice, Miss Jones. Tell me about why you picked this poem.
Um, I really like this poem because it's one of those where it's quite short, and I think sometimes my students kind of struggle with what to say about it, especially when it's obvious to compare it with other poems in the cluster, but I often find that they don't write as much about No Problem by Benjamin Zephaniah as they do the other poem that they might choose. So I think it's nice to kind of dig a bit deeper into kind of some of the, linguistical and structural choices that Benjamin Zephaniah makes. And as well as what sort of kind of political or social messages that he's sharing in the poem.
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to hearing about this because I think from reading it today and researching a little bit on Zephaniah's background, which we'll chat about in a minute, I kind of worked out what I think are the big messages in the poem, but I've probably not worked out as much about the structure. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that a bit later on. So we'll start off by talking a little bit about Zephaniah's background, really, and where he's coming from in terms of his authorial intention of writing this poem and his message. I was doing some research, and he grew up in Birmingham, I believe, in the 1950s. I'm not from Birmingham. I'm a northerner, as you can tell by my accent. And I didn't know much about the kind of really bad race relations that were going on in the West Midlands in the 1960s. Do you tend to teach the kids about that background?
Yes, we do tend to kind of delve into Benjamin Zephaniah's upbringing because not only did he face a lot of racial discrimination growing up, but he also faced discrimination because he was dyslexic and really
Ah.
struggled to read. And I think that kind of combination of kind of, being an outsider in different ways, he really quite felt it. And I think it's important for us all to know that sometimes, whilst it might be our race or our disability that hold us back, it's where those intersections meet that makes it that much harder for people to kind of be understood and to be accepted into kind of the mainstream. So yeah, we do go in a little bit into that, and I think it it's truly reflected in Zephaniah's poems because he deviates from so many norms, in particular with kind of like his poetic form and the language he uses. Uh, so I think it is important to know his background because that kind of it's reflected in his writing, in his poetry.
Yeah, I mean, I knew a little bit about Zephaniah before this because we have studied previous poems of his at Key Stage 3, etc. over the years that I've been teaching. But when I actually looked into kind of what it was like in the West Midlands when he was growing up, especially, it seemed to be like a hothouse of racial tension, really. I was reading about how the community was completely divided, and a lot of it was due to immigration. And actually, Zephaniah was born in the West Midlands, wasn't it? But because of the kind of miseducation, I suppose, the fear mongering of the press at the time, and I think there was a conservative politician, and I can't remember his name now, but yes, Enoch Powell, yeah, and he preyed on kind of the worries and the fears, didn't he, of people with his rivers of blood speech. And I think, you know, Zephaniah couldn't have helped, I suppose, to have felt and witnessed these racial tensions. I read something about the University of Birmingham doing a study at the time, and they said that 80% of landlords at the time, private landlords, said that they wouldn't let to Black people at all, or actually any person of colour. And that's quite shocking, you know, for us to understand today. But from what I can make out from what Zephaniah has said in interviews, etc., he still thinks that kind of racism exists today, but it's more subtle.
Yes, yeah, and I think, you know, whilst kind of Benjamin Zephaniah was coming of age, you do have a lot of that overt racism. I think there's actually a specific term for the kind of housing discrimination that a lot of Black and people of colour experience. I think it's called rachmatism. I might be incorrect.
Wow, I'll have to look that up. Never heard of that before.
Yeah, kind of often being kind of forced to live in these, I suppose you could say, ghettos or really squalid conditions. It was particularly the case where my own family grew up in West London in Notting Hill. But with Zephaniah, the poem No Problem, he wrote it in the 1990s, you know, which was not that long ago. Neither is the 1980s. But, you know, I think there was this kind of broad sense that, oh, you know, racism doesn't happen over in Britain. It's not as bad as it is in the US. But I think it's really important for us to note that it's built into the very systems which we are part of. And Benjamin Zephaniah is trying to kind of unveil the, you know, the subtle racism that people experience. And sometimes there's a bit of exceptionalism as well, because I was looking at the context, you know, kind of what were race relations and racism like in the 1990s. And many of our students will probably know about the charity called Stand Up to Racism, or I think it's Give Racism the Red Card.
Oh, yes, I remember that. I remember the advertising campaign, yeah.
Yes, and that was founded in the 1990s. Now, it's interesting because the footballer who founded that said, I think his name was Shaka Hislop. He said,
"Oh, I remember him. Yeah, yes. I'm an ex-Newcastle United fan, you see, so he played for us, Shaka."
Yeah, and he sort of I'm going a bit off topic here, but he sort of said about how one time he was called some awful names whilst he was getting petrol, and then the people who were calling him names realized that he was a famous footballer, and they said, oh, you know, can we get your autograph, all that sort of thing. And there's this idea that, oh, well, some of us are okay, but not all of us. And I think Zephaniah sort of picks up on that in his poem as well. So it is important to kind of know Benjamin Zephaniah's context and how he grew up, but also the context of when the poem was written.
Yeah, because like you say, the 90s, I suppose to the kids that we teach nowadays, the 90s seems like a million years ago. I mean, I've had kids coming in on own clothes day to me wearing 90s stuff and going, "Miss, vintage." And I'm like, oh God. When vintage is younger than you are, I think you're in trouble, really. But yeah, I mean, to think of some of these things that he's saying to be like a kind of subtle commentary, I suppose, on even the institutional racism that still goes on, as you were saying, you know, in institutions such as schools, really, in the 1990s is quite terrifying, really. And I'm sure I remember reading a study as part of my doctorate, actually. And it was in a West London school, and it was questioning a group of Black teenage girls, a group of Chinese girls, a group of students, I think, that were mixed, boys and girls from Pakistani origins. And they were asking them about like any discrimination that they think they face, and this was only a few years ago, and some of the things that they thought the teachers thought of them, and some of the teachers describing some of the louder girls who were natural leaders, really, as kind of gobby Black girls, you know, as if there was this kind of reputation. And I think it is endemic, isn't it? It is, you know, buried into our very institutions, and it's very hard to get out. And I think I got from this poem and from what you've just been saying about it, that I think Zephaniah is kind of trying to bring that to the fore, really, and highlight it.
Yeah, like I think it probably doesn't seem so now, but it interests me how Benjamin Zephaniah pretty much was painted as a radical when he was kind of coming of fame in the 1990s and 1980s. And to be honest, saying racism is wrong is not a radical thing to say. But of course, with considering the context of Britain, you know, kind of speaking out against the establishment, as many might say, was seen as quite a huge thing. And I think, you know, Benjamin Zephaniah, he has been in it for so long, so long. And the fact that his poems still rings true today, even though, okay, the 1990s wasn't very long ago for many of us, you know, that still highlights a huge problem in our society and with the way that kind of our institutions still work today.
I reckon this could have been written like yesterday. I don't feel like it's aged at all, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's crazy, really.
Yeah.
So should we have a look at the poem then, and have a little chat about it? So I mean, I was kind of grabbed straight away by the personal tone at the start of it, you know. Straight away, I am not the problem. So you know that this is going to be really personal to him. That refrain, you know, it's all the way through the poem, isn't it? And it sounds harsh at first. It's kind of him standing up and saying, it's not me, you know, it's the rest of the people around me. What do you make of that opening?
I think it's I really like sorry, I'm just gonna say I'm gonna take a step back a little bit, because I like the personal kind of take the tone of the poem, but I think I am not the problem is very different to the tone of the title, no problem.
Yes.
So often, like, it's a saying that we always say as British people, oh, no problem, that's okay, that's fine. And it's kind of, we often use it, I think Benjamin Zephaniah is mocking British politeness in a way, because we have, you know, we kind of say, oh, no problem, to kind of politely dismiss something, right? And that's often what happens with racism, in that it's dismissed or pushed to the side. You know, we've had, you know, in the news even recently, kind of the way that certain figures, Meghan Markle, has been treated, and, you know, a lot of the kind of microaggressions that she has experienced and many people of colour experience in Britain. And it's kind of pushed down as saying, no, not a problem. It's not something that we experience here. And so I think the title, the kind of the politeness of the title contrasts completely with the kind of, you know, a confrontational, maybe even a little bit kind of what's the word I'm looking for?
Accusatory, maybe?
Yes, accusatory tone of the poem.
Yeah, I hadn't made that link between the juxtaposition of the two of them, but I think you're spot on completely. I think a lot of people, it's that very British thing of not wanting to discuss things that make us uncomfortable. And I think he hits that on the head, doesn't he? straight away there. And then I really like the continuation of that kind of hostile opening with that alliterative B sound, but I bear the brunt. You can hear him almost kind of spitting it out. He's bearing the brunt of this. He's innocent. He's not done anything. He's but he's still kind of being persecuted almost. How do you think it continues from there?
Well, we have quite a lot of kind of harsh sounds. So as you've pointed out, bear the brunt. We've got the born academic. He's trying to point out how, I am completely qualified to be a respected person in British society, yet you still try to pull me down. And I think it's this idea that you have to be you have to be academic, you have to have these kind of accolades that prove you are one of the good ones. And it's kind of, he's presenting that argument, but he's also pulling it apart, because towards the end he talks about how he says, mother country, get it right. Not all of us are wanting to be, he says, you put me in a pigeonhole. Not all of us are the stereotypes that you make us out to be. So I think from the very beginning of the poem right to the end, he really is pushing the reader to think about their preconceptions that they have about, people of color, but I think, in general as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting you mention about the thing where he talks about, I'm born academic. He kind of strengthens that a few lines down when he talks about, I can teach you of Timbuktu, and Timbuktu being this scholarly centre of Africa due to the university and the book trade, and to Europeans it's this place of mystery, isn't it? And it marks him as kind of elite and scholarly, but it's like you say, almost as if he needs to evidence it and in order to prove it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think he's trying to draw it's even by kind of the language he's using. So he uses what I think is Jamaican patois in a way to kind of almost make the reader feel like an outsider in the poem, the way that he has been an outsider in British society, because he's obviously writing a poem that's towards white British people who are either ignorant or are racist. And whilst he's trying to send a message, it's almost as if he's like, well, I'm going to use the language I have for you to understand on my terms what I'm experiencing. So,
It reminds me a little bit of the poem by John Agard, Checking Out My History. I don't know whether you've ever read that one. And he uses a similar dialect. I'm not sure it's exactly the same, but I've always kind of read it as like him rebelling against kind of the stuffy English grammar, really. And it was this line in this poem that stood out to me: if you give I a chance. It's almost kind of, I don't know, done as real kind of rebellion of, actually I'm gonna do this on my own terms. And it's something that I recognise from Agard's poetry as well. And I think Agard actually moved to the Midlands when he was a teenager, so completely different experience to Zephaniah, but a lot of the same problems with the kind of institutional racism of the school, really, and growing up and the public. So I just thought it was a really interesting parallel.
Yeah, because you know, in the Edexcel cluster, there's also a poem by Agard called Half Caste.
Oh, we did that at Key Stage 3. It's a great poem, yeah.
Yeah. And I think often they're seen as, you know, presenting the kind of racial conflict that arises from, you know, being a racial other, you could say, in Britain. And, you know, Benjamin Zephaniah and John Agard have been around for like ages. But this is kind of an aside, but I think we also have to think, well, why is it that their poems have had such staying power? And I think, as you said earlier, that this poem could have been written the other day, and I think that's still the case for some of Agard's poems as well. Checking out my history, for example, about this complete kind of ignoring or eradication of British history that is not set in Britain or happening in Britain, because Britain, of course, had empires and colonies. And yeah, I think they are two poets that are quite good to compare, but they're also rather different.
Yes,
as well.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they both had obviously very different experiences.
Yes, definitely. And I think Agard is inclined to be a bit more kind of comical.
Yeah.
In his poems, whereas Zephaniah, he really kind of cuts straight to the bone. He's not mincing his words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Apart from that hilarious tongue-in-cheek sarcasm at the end of this one, you know, some of my best friends are white. I mean, classic kind of what white people use as an excuse when people call them racist. I mean, I just think that's such a genius end to this poem. It really is. You know, it really does kind of give him the upper hand, doesn't it, really, at the end of this, but such a serious message as well.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I found quite interesting about this as well is some of the things he mentions about in the first half of it, at the beginning of the first stanza, where he talks about the silly playground talks and the racist stunts. And I thought, like, even calling them silly, it kind of trivializes his experiences. And I can almost imagine that word being used by a teacher, you know, him saying to the teacher at the time, you know, Miss such a body said something about me, and them saying, oh, they're just being silly. Just ignore them. It's just silliness. And the thing underneath, the racist stunts, the stunts makes it sound trivial, like it's a joke. But obviously these things have stuck with him because, you know, however many years later he's writing about this.
Yeah. I want to zoom in on what you've said about the word silly, because I'm just thinking even back to doing an inspector calls with my students at the moment. And Mr. Burling often uses the word silly, or the word silly in general is used a lot in the play to kind of, as you say, trivialize things. And it's often the more powerful dismissing the experiences of those who are kind of bearing the brunt, as Zephaniah says in his poem, or those who are vulnerable to kind of the racism and the oppression experienced by those in power. And yeah, it's painful actually sometimes to read this poem, because, you know, it's still something that happens today, and it's so easily dismissed. And, you know, it's kind of almost a thing that, oh, as you go through your life, at some point you're going to experience racism. And it's often in these kind of ignorant, silly ways in which kind of children, you know, I think it says something about children as well, can be quite mean to one another. And I think that's, you know, him drawing on that shows how, you know, not just adults are kind of causing these problems, but also children. It's kind of a generational thing. How do we get rid of racism from one generation to another?
There's a lot of very deep issues in this poem, isn't there, to discuss with students, even going down to just below that with the comments he makes. But they got me on the run. Now I'm a branded athletic. It reminds me of the story you told about Shaka Hislop before, how, because he's a footballer, because he's a person of colour, he must be a good sportsman, he must be fast. And the thing about dancing in there as well, and these stereotypes, they still persist.
Yeah.
And we're, what, 40 years after he was at school, probably, which is quite terrifying. And the thing about being on the run, I was thinking it's like a link to the stereotype of black youths being in trouble and running from the police, because it was just the way he said on the run. Is that the way you'd interpret it, or would you see it a different way?
Yeah, I would definitely interpret that way. These stereotypes are, they're so kind of embedded in the experiences of Black people. Like you hardly, even now, whilst it's coming kind of more to light, more kind of Black people in loads of different roles, and people of color as well, we still have, a huge amount of coverage of those who are in the entertainment industry. And I think it's almost as if racism is entertainment for some people. And I think it's kind of, so often we view Black people as kind of, often in the entertainment industry, whether it's sport, whether it's music, whether it's dance. And some Black people, especially now when you think of Stormzy or Dave, they are using their tool of music or of entertainment to use their voice for something else. Or Marcus Rashford with trying to campaign for free school meals during holidays. And I just think, again, it's like, it's something that it's only just kind of beginning to happen now, but still Black people are pigeonholed, as Zephaniah says, into these kind of entertainment roles. And it's a bit uncomfortable sometimes to think of Black people as a source of entertainment. Like there's some sort of historical thread there that I can't quite put it into words, but it's kind of this, oh, well, that's what we expect them to do sort of thing. But as soon as someone is, an academic, as Zephaniah says, it's kind of, it makes British society, I would say, quite uneasy. We've Zephaniah is part of a group of different academics, Black British academics, who are trying to make movements in the academic system, such as Bernardine Evaristo, and others as well. And still it's kind of doesn't get the same light as something that someone who was a sport figure or music figure would get. I think Zephaniah is quite good at kind of pulling out the tensions between, well, what are we willing to accept as a society and what makes us a bit too uncomfortable? What are we not quite ready to delve into yet?
I wonder whether we should be made to feel uncomfortable at times, though, because I think it's good for us. If we look at, I was interested in the fact that they were just two big stanzas. And what struck me about them is kind of the difference in the tone of the two stanzas as well. Like, I feel like the first one is much more of a defiant tone, whereas the second is a lot more serious. What's your take on it?
I thought the structure of these two stanzas definitely was another way of Zephaniah deviating from poetic norms. So you know, the poem's written in an ABCD rhyme scheme, and it would seem natural that he would put them into quatrains, but he doesn't. And I think, as you say, it kind of signals that shift in tone at the end. And, you know, the first poem, it's like he's trying to prove himself, trying to relay all his experiences and prove, you know, this is what makes me someone who's kind of worthy of being accepted by British society. And then in the second stanza, he's pinning it on the reader, he's pinning it on those in British society who haven't done a good job, basically. They've not taken ownership of their kind of position within British history, British colonial history in particular, as well as kind of, you know, how are they complicit in racism as well? So he talks of how, you know, black is not the problem, mother country, get it right. And there's something about that line, mother country, get it right, because, you know, I certainly remember growing up, my, you know, kind of, I would say my grandparents' generation would, you know, they saw Britain as being this kind of amazing place that, you know, a lot of British ideals were taught in schools in Jamaica, where my family is from. And, you know, when they got here, they were kind of expecting the kind of warm embrace that they didn't get. You know, there was no sort of appreciation of kind of filling basically the gap that was left by World War II, where unfortunately many soldiers lost their lives and many of the British population lost their lives. And it's, as we can even see today with the Windrush scandal, it just seems to have been washed over, you know. Britain still doesn't seem to want to accept parts of its history that kind of colour it in any way, or you know, we're still campaigning for British colonial history to be taught in schools, included on GCSE specs. And I think it's important for our students to know that, because they obviously are presented with this in some way. Certainly in my school, we are very diverse. And a lot of my students, they experience these tensions almost every day. And it's like Zephaniah saying, you know, get it right, okay? Try. And, you know, I think it kind of gets right to the heart, because it's like nothing's been done, nothing's been solved yet, or progress hasn't happened fast enough, you know. But yeah, definitely that second stanza pins it on the reader, which again is quite provocative, I would say, because this poem is obviously, as I mentioned earlier, meant for someone who's kind of complicit in some way in the oppression that people of colour experience in Britain, either knowingly or unknowingly, you know. If I remembered it correctly, I think Toni Morrison says something about the idea of the black person in the white imagination. It's quite, that last line for some people will still be quite unsettling, this idea of different races getting on well and, you know, enjoying each other's company. It's I kind of see it as Benjamin Zephaniah kind of poking fun at those people who are like, oh, no, I don't have any friends of color. I'm not quite sure if I would be comfortable having any friends of color, you know. Yeah, I think he's definitely a poet of the dub poetry generation, where, you know, they would use reggae backing tracks against their poetry. I think there's a famous poet from South London where I teach, called Linton Kwesi Johnson, and, you know, he used sometimes the message that he was presenting in his poems were, they kind of completely juxtaposed against the kind of fun musicality of the reggae in the background. And it's that kind of jarring experience which I think is probably something that Black British people or people of color experience a lot. This kind of, you know, you're here and you're British, you know, this is everything you've known, and then you still have people who think you're not British, or people who they can't accept you. And I think it's Zephaniah, he No Problem was also read against reggae music as well. And I think it's that kind of jarring experience which British people of color experience a lot. But yeah, poets such as Benjamin Zephaniah are really good at kind of showing us, well, what is the problem, and, you know, possibly presenting us with answers to it.
Well, thank you so much. I actually really wish I taught this poem now, because I feel like I've learned so much about it, and I'm gutted it's not on our spec. But I'll certainly do it with some Key Stage 3 classes and as an unseen poem as well with my GCSE classes. And thank you very much for your expertise and all of your insights. No, I've really enjoyed it. It's been fab. And I'd love to have you back anytime as well. So if you haven't already, please check out the other videos. I'm doing these videos fairly regularly now with as many different English teachers as I can to get some fantastic perspectives that I won't have thought of, and I'm sure you won't have as well. Please join in the discussion. You can comment when I share it on social media. We'd love to hear what you think of this poem as well and your interpretations. So remember to like, share, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you for the next one. Thank you.